Welcome back to the Health Marketing Collective, where strong leadership meets marketing excellence. I'm your host, Sara Payne, and I'm bringing you fascinating conversations with some of the industry's top marketing minds. Today's episode is all about trust. We'll dig into some fascinating data and insights on the state of trust within the healthcare industry. We'll explore how it's shaping consumer behavior, influencing health-related decisions, and even impacting health outcomes. I've called in an expert from the leading source on trust in our industry, the Edelman Trust Barometer. Joining me is Paul Ratzky, Executive Vice President of Health Technology for Edelman. He and his team counsel companies across the health spectrum, including life sciences, payers, health systems, big tech, and startups on the front lines of AI, connected care, and digital health initiatives. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Let's start with some background for our listeners who may not be familiar with the Trust Barometer. Can you give us a brief overview of the report and some of the key takeaways from this year?
Sure. So Edelman has been doing our flagship Trust Barometer, which is a bigger picture view of institutions and trust for going on 25 years now. But 3 years ago, coming out of the pandemic, we decided to do a special report on trust in health. So we've been doing that for 3 consecutive years now. So that's what this 2024 edition of this study was, that came out a little bit earlier this year. We had over 15,000 respondents. So it's quite an extensive piece of research across multiple countries, and we break it up into segments from geographies, demographics, et cetera. But real top line, a few of the key takeaways this year. First off, slightly disturbingly, the 4 major institutional sectors that we measure, which is media, government, NGOs, and business, all 4 of them went down in rankings in terms of the trustworthiness of the ability to impart health information. And in fact, all of them are now in what we consider distrust levels. So that's quite a revelation in terms of the way information comes across. The one media specifically has come down 14 points since pre-pandemic. So really interesting to see what's happened there. Another key point is the politicizing of healthcare, which we've seen the politicizing, obviously, of society as a whole, but that's really now come into healthcare and is impacting how people view information and make decisions. It's actually viewed as a bigger problem by almost all sectors than things like the next pandemic, affordability. I mean, a really huge problem that people are viewing that way. With that comes misinformation, another key point that's come out of here. So people are trying to understand, what are the motives behind the information that I'm reading? Why am I getting contradictory medical information? Why are the recommendations changing? So people, that is now a concern that is on par with access to care and the cost of care. So people are really viewing that as an impediment to better health, is really just knowing the right information. That becomes especially important because of another dynamic, which is self-empowerment. People are more and more now feeling the need to empower themselves with this information to make these decisions. And we're actually seeing the correlation between trust and empowerment. They're 2 different dynamics, but together, that's what's leading to the best health outcomes. So as more and more people are trying to become empowered with this information, it becomes really important. It's interesting that 1 in 3 people feel like if they do research, they can be just as informed as their doctor. That number jumps to 1 in 2 for the under 35 crowd. So that really shows you the extent of this empowerment and where it's going, and why this misinformation problem becomes such a huge issue. 2 other last key findings worth noting. One is the real rising prominence of the physician in all of this. People really look to, and specifically my doctor. So people have much more trust in their doctor than in the greatest global healthcare expert. It's like, it's this localization. It's similar to what we saw with business, where business trust changes dramatically when it's my employer. So my employer is very, very trusted for healthcare information. My doctor is very, very trusted. And beyond just issues of what I'm talking about with my doctor, my care, but bigger picture issues. if you want to understand about a public health issue, a policy, people are actually trusting their doctors to hear more about that. And then lastly, sort of more in my realm, is the concerns around technology innovation in healthcare. Actually, our flagship trust barometer this year really focused on the risks of innovation and how people were not trusting innovations. And we saw that translate into the healthcare realm. So people are really voicing concerns about that. 63% of people in the US felt that technology was going to have an adverse effect on healthcare in the next 5 years.
Wow.
So there's a lot of ambivalence both ways. The concerns are real. So it's something that really needs to be addressed in this age of AI, which I'm sure we'll talk about more.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot to unpack there. Excellent overview for starters. And I have to say, I'm really glad that Edelman made the decision to do a very health specific report. What'd you say, 4 years ago?
Yep.
Because it's so incredibly important for those of us that are, leading the charge here, getting information out there, trying to educate folks on how to make smart decisions for their healthcare. So, really important topic for this particular podcast in terms of how are health leaders or marketing leaders supposed to respond to and deal with some of these factors as it relates to the declining trust within the industry. Let's start. One of the points that I wanted to dive into first is this declining trust in institutions. From a marketing perspective, what can organizations do to rebuild that trust with their audiences?
First off, we have to be careful with our marketing.
Yeah.
Right.
Fair point.
I think first off, and we talk about this in both of the reports this year, the acknowledgement that these issues are there, the acknowledgement that there is a politicizing of things and that is a problem and people have to sort through that, and an acknowledgement that there's information out there that may be contradictory or may not be correct. And so a lot of it has to do with acknowledging the problem and then becoming an institution that wants to be a part of the solution. And that's why I made the little crack about marketing, but it actually becomes about, am I part of the solution? Am I an institution that's putting more trustworthy healthcare information out there? Is that part of my role, which is different than just selling my service or servicing my patients, but being a healthcare information leader, right? And part of that is putting science front and center. And we talk a lot about sort of a reemergence of science, but it has to happen on a different way. In our main trust barometer this year, we said science has to integrate better with society. Like science has to take a primary role, but they have to relate to people better and tell stories in a way that people can digest. So, I think we know the importance of it, and we know that that's where truth and facts lie, but we have to do a better job of putting those voices front and center in ways that are really digestible for society as a whole. So that's a really big part of this.
I'm curious, Paul, on that specific point of putting science front and center and finding ways to relate better to people. Can you think of any examples? Do you see any companies or brands that you think are doing this particularly well, that are kind of a good, example for the rest to follow?
I think there's a lot of just examples. I won't name any companies, but just things that I see happening.
Sure. Yeah.
First off is making sure that people like chief medical officers are talking, and with a lot of our clients, we're saying we don't want the CEO or the head of technology or whoever it is. That chief medical officer has to be out there and sharing this information and talking about it from their point of view. We're also trying to get much more into data that's really impactful. Like, here's the impact that this is having. Here's what we're doing on the ground. Sharing that kind of information where people can really understand tangibly. And again, all of this goes back to when we started this during the vaccines, right?
Yes.
And having to separate fact from fiction with real data. And also, I think personal stories are becoming more important. Lived experiences. And so whether that's in a B2B sense, having partners saying, here's what's happening as I'm using this technology, or whether it's patients saying, here's what's happening when I use this, type of therapy, or when I'm going to this institution. So I think those kind of stories are all more impactful and make people have a better understanding of what's going on. And, underlying a lot of this is transparency. It's just being a little more open about here's what we do, here's how we do it, here's why we do it, right? A lot of this comes back to purpose.
Yes.
And I'm not going to beat the purpose-driven drum. That's all over the place, but it really does apply here. And I think in some ways it's actually been underdone in healthcare because it's almost been assumed, right?
Right.
We're in healthcare, of course we are mission-driven, and but this distrust says, why is a hospital doing this? Why is a payer doing this? Why is a technology company doing that? Even what's the motive of my physician in recommending this test? I mean, there's a lot of issues that it's not a given in terms of why you do what you do. So there's a lot of transparency that I think can be greatly increased to build that trust.
Yeah, and these are all really excellent sort of practical examples that folks can implement that make a huge difference when it comes to trust. And so many of these things are baked into what we already know from what are the good principles of content marketing? What are the good principles of thought leadership? What are the principles of storytelling, right? It is be real with me, right? Acknowledge if something's broken or it's not working the way that it should. Let's not gloss over that. Let's acknowledge that. Let's share stories from people that are actually, to your point, lived experiences. They've gone through it. So in transparency, so critically important.
There's an empathy underneath there that again,
Absolutely.
should be more of a given in our industry, but there's a lot of people who don't feel. I'll tell you a funny story. There was a chatbot test after Gen AI first came out, and they were actually chatbots as physician assistants who were doing the interaction.
Oh yeah.
And the chatbots got a higher score on two areas. One was quality of information, and one was empathy. Now, that's not scary. That they viewed the chatbot as more empathetic than the physician live.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's a great segue, actually, Paul, because I wanted to go into AI next. You mentioned that AI in healthcare faces skepticism. And how should marketers that are promoting these innovative technologies address those concerns in their marketing?
Yeah, what's interesting in the data we're seeing in AI is that it's an ambivalence in the pure sense of the word, strong feelings both ways, right? People are excited about what it can be and what it can do, but they have a concern about how is it being implemented and what are the unintended consequences. So I think it's very important. Again, transparency comes to the fore here, but it's not being perceived as a cheerleader per se, but saying we're really seeing a technology that can solve a lot of the problems that are already here. This isn't a technology in search of a solution. This can help with some of the challenges that healthcare has been facing, and to be very specific about how it's being deployed. And that is everything from what data was used to develop it, who's overseeing its implementation, who's consulted, what is our human oversight policy in those things. So I think all of those things have to be really spelled out for people as they roll this out. There's a lot of pilots going on, a lot of testing. So people start small and then they scale. That's really important. And people are also taking a very proactive stance about what regulation and oversight is going to look like here. It's one of the first times we've seen the industry come together and actually go to Capitol Hill and say, hey, we want to talk about how we're going to regulate this, and we want this done, and we want to figure this out. So I think everyone has to be a bit of a thought leader and a proponent for what responsible use looks like, not just for themselves, but for the industry. Because for a lot of people, it's a black box, right? it's a thing that they just don't quite understand. And algorithms are very mysterious things. And sometimes they are the proprietary product in and of themselves. So trying to say, here's how this works can be really, really tricky.
Yeah, it seems to me as though the health industry is sort of held to a little bit of a different standard when it comes to tech innovation and technology adoption comparison to other sectors. What do you see there, Paul? What factors contribute to that? I mean, obviously, we're talking about people's lives here, but kind of what's at play there?
I could talk for an hour just on this. It's initially why about a decade ago I came into healthcare. I was working in the digital disruption of other industries and doing all across. And I looked at healthcare and I went, wow, it's 10 years behind. And yet it's the most important sector possible because, its lives are at stake. But when you are in the weeds, you really realize how different the industry is, right? Both because of its own impediments, right? There's regulations and HIPAA
Yes.
and the way the technology is set up and siloed. I mean, we're not about connected systems and, shared information, right? It's siloed. The respect for authority, all those dynamics that technology, as it's come into other industries, has handled it very differently, right? They're coming in. Disruption is not a word that is really embraced in healthcare. Disintermediation, right? Undercutting authority, moving fast, breaking things, connecting everything. All these things that has been the bedrock of digital innovation in all these sectors doesn't quite apply correctly to healthcare. So everything has been a much slower adoption in health, and they are considered widely behind, but it's why AI has been such a shock to the system. Because, to be fair, AI has been around for a while, but when Gen AI suddenly explodes and suddenly healthcare is being asked in a period of months
right.
to suddenly adopt something, it's just not the way our industry is, is set up. And the risks are higher, but you can also argue that the benefits are more important.
Absolutely. I'd agree with you on that. What are some of the other technologies or innovations besides AI that you're most excited about in terms of healthcare innovation?
Yeah, I think obviously there's a whole range of personal devices in the realm of remote monitoring and personal and wearables that I think are really, really evolving to become, both medical grade from the personal point of view and much more interconnected sort of from the clinical point of view. And so whether it's robotics or whether it's been interesting seeing the introduction of something like, I know Lingo was just launched. So people are now monitoring, but not diabetics. They're just monitoring their, how they process food. And so they're using this medical technology for general health, and that's happening in all sorts of ways. But I think ultimately it's all, and obviously robotics is now getting into surgery, and virtual reality is happening in those realms. Digital twins is a really interesting technology that's now simulating body parts, if not entire bodies. So we can understand the impact of therapies on someone before we actually give it to them. But I think ultimately what we're looking at is sort of the vision of connected health that's been talked about for a while is starting to come to fruition now. All these individual things, it's like, okay, but how does that connect? And I think more and more of these innovations are going to have to define where do I live in the continuum? How do I fit in? What do I connect to? Because ultimately that's the promise here, is that everything's talking to each other. This data is all coming together in a holistic way so that we can see things, understand things, not have the duplication, not have the black holes of information.
Yeah, such an exciting time to be in the healthcare industry for sure. You mentioned—
exciting is one word for it.
Yeah, well, there you go. You mentioned empowerment, and that people are feeling more empowered to take control of their health, which is fantastic in many ways. It has its downsides, as some of the things you highlighted earlier. How can healthcare organizations tap into this shift, this empowered consumer shift, to build trust and create stronger, more meaningful connections with their customers?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. Earlier, you were talking about the standards of content creators. But I
Yep.
think if you went to a lot of healthcare organizations, they wouldn't consider themselves content creators. So I think that's the starting point, is just saying, if that is your role, is to help change this health information ecosystem, first view yourself as that's your job. And then, also understand that your role is to arm the patient. We want to make you a better informed. We want to partner with you. More and more, we're seeing when innovations come out, we're actually consulting with physicians, with patients, and making them a part of these teams that are trying to figure these things out and understand why these things happen. I think there's also a sense of going where people are.
Yes.
So I'll give you an example. Since 2023, there have been over 200 billion, with a B, views of healthcare information on YouTube.
Wow. That's huge.
YouTube is fairly aggressively trying to become a more authoritative source of healthcare information by recognizing who these sources are. And we're seeing more and more institutions like Mayo and Cleveland Clinic, and individual physicians, and even people who are doing lived experience. With a cancer diagnosis, you're just as likely to say, what's it like to go through chemotherapy, as you are to say what sort of, right? So thinking about where you're putting your content, and where do people go when they try to get empowered with this information, I think it becomes a really important part of it.
Yeah. I mean, to your earlier point, the media landscape, right? Trusted media is down 14 points, right? Plus media in general, the business model is challenged. And so brands have been themselves challenged to find new ways to reach their audiences. And it sounds like if brands are not prioritizing YouTube as a critical distribution channel for education about their disease states, therapy areas, treatments, insert solution here, it's a missed opportunity for brands and for marketers today.
Social media in general, obviously influencers have become huge.
Yes.
And it's interesting in that empowerment phase, as people say, I'm trying to find health information on my own. One of the most trusted sources is friends and family. So that component becomes really critical. Now, interestingly, while it's one of the highest, it actually came down this year. And the reason for that is the misinformation problem crept into my friends and family.
Sure.
As we all know, with family members, maybe, who we have disagreements about truth, right?
Yep.
So, but friends and family is a very important aspect of this too. So, when we're thinking about, again, the places people go and how word of mouth happens, a place like social media is a major driver of that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the role of physicians. You said people are increasingly looking to doctors, physicians to play a bigger role in broader health conversations. How should marketers be thinking about that?
Yeah. So I think, we try to think about what type of content is more, digestible for physicians, and also where. So again, as I said earlier, bringing our medical personnel and scientists and R&D front and center in our communications is something that's going to be much more responsive to a physician audience. We've had some clients, especially like in the tech realm, who are trying to publish sort of peer-reviewed papers, sort of taking more of a science approach versus marketing, and saying, this is why this tool is this way and something. So really appealing to them with the sort of data and facts that they really respond to becomes really, really important. And also, reaching out to them where they are. I mean, things like Sermo, and Doximity have become right. It's like, those are places to go to, and of course conferences and events, which I think in some ways got devalued a bit during the pandemic, but in some ways those are really reemerging as really strong places to find certain segments that are very difficult to find otherwise.
Well, and I think your other example earlier of, when you have somebody, being the face of your campaign, out on the podium or whatever it is, posting on social media, talking with the media, have that be your chief medical officer, have that be someone who carries the clinician credentials, because that's going to help increase trust with the audience.
Or did you involve external physicians?
That's where I was going to go is, do you have any tips around that and how to do that in a, authentic way that's not just like, I have my own opinions about this, but like, hey, we paid this clinician, to say this great thing about our brand. Obviously there's disclosures around all of that, but tips, advice you have on great ways, successful ways to integrate third-party clinicians into marketing campaigns.
Physicians are saying they want to be involved in the development. So it's not about the marketing, it's about the product development. It's like, when we're figuring out how are we creating smart rooms in our hospital, how are we creating, new applications in the EHRs, when we're doing remote monitoring and connected health and hospital at home, it's like, are you involving frontline physicians and very, very importantly, nurses? We're actually finding nurses being more receptive to a lot of the technology innovation than physicians. I don't think there's any ego involved there at all, but so are they actually involved in the development of the product, not just in the marketing of it? I think that becomes a really, really important part. It's also worth noting we have to be careful of the cross-pollination of some of these trends. The reliance on the physician is great, but 4 in 10, especially in our under 35 cohort, said, if I think my doctor doesn't have my political beliefs, I will no longer see him.
Yeah.
So the politicizing of healthcare and the trust in the physician intersects in a weird way, and we see a lot of that.
And to your point, I think having some clear understanding of personas on a demographic level to understand, this kind of content for this group over here, and maybe it needs to look a little different for this group over here.
In our study, we've actually broken out, when we have that trust and empowerment dynamic, we've broken out the 4 segments. When you have trust and empowerment together, but when you have the bottom segment where you have neither, or if you have trust without empowerment, then you get someone who's very differential to the system. And if you have empowerment without trust, you have someone who's very skeptical.
Yeah.
We've actually seen a 20% bump in health outcomes for people in that top segment who have that both, because they've got the information, but they're trusting, so they're making better decisions.
Wow.
And also their embrace of that innovation. Those numbers I talked about with like acceptance of AI in key areas like patient interaction, diagnosis, drug discovery, hugely different with that crowd, far more accepting, far more willing to embrace it. So that's the segmentation, more than just, obviously seeing some of the age differences and seeing some of the country by country differences is really interesting, but I'm really fascinated by that empowered health.
Absolutely.
And finding that sweet spot of empowerment and trust together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Paul, I'd like to switch gears for a quick fire segment before we conclude the episode. I've got 5 questions for you. In one word, how would you describe the current state of trust in healthcare?
Say precarious.
It's a good one. That's a good one. I had a feeling you were going to go in that direction. What's the number one mistake healthcare brands make when communicating with consumers?
I would say it's that empathy word again. I don't think we've done a good job of putting ourselves in the shoes of who we're talking to. And that applies as much in B2B as it is in consumer. But I think institutions are just too wrapped up in their own mission and purpose and things. And I think we need to really come at it more from the eyes of the audience.
This one's sort of a trick question. Do you believe social media has more potential to build trust or break trust in healthcare?
Ooh, that's a loaded one.
I know, right?
I'm actually going to say build. And
I'm with you there. I'm an optimist, Paul.
Yeah, I'm an optimist, and I think it just follows people's drift to there. I mean, as it becomes the major place you get news, it becomes the major place you're sharing content. It's the people you follow, if you spend more time watching YouTube videos than watching television, like that's the place where it has to happen. And I see a lot of positive things happening. And I see a lot of backlash to the negativity and a recognition of things like I was actually at a mental health summit last week, and it was talking about teens and social media. And so I think the fact that we're recognizing that and trying to adjust, I think bodes well for where it will go, because it's not going away.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm curious, does the trust barometer dive into trust you have media as kind of one category. Is social media embedded into that, or do you kind of break that out in its own?
No, we don't get that micro for this. We've definitely done some other studies of different nature where we've sort of understand those dynamics more, but not specifically in the health care realm. But I think people's affinity for the content and the personalities in social media is just so much stronger than trying to do so much traditional marketing. I mean, I'm constantly looking, my wife watches all of these YouTube videos and while they're sharing something and she's going, oh, I need to look into that. And I said, boy, if that had been a print ad, it's like, I would have gotten nowhere. Right. But suddenly there's this trust and this interest in this. So I just, we're seeing the affinity that people have for it. And it's really just, I think, mastering it in the right way while constantly eliminating some of the negative things that have happened, which I think all of the platforms are actively working on. I don't want to talk for X at this point. For some interesting reasons.
Fair point.
Yeah.
What's the one thing that healthcare brands should stop doing in order to regain trust?
I would say there's a combination of sort of cheerleading and chest beating that happens that sort of implies that the trust and the believability is implicit. And I think sort of it's almost a vulnerability to say, we know this is hard. We know you have challenges. We know that we're trying to figure this out. We know that we don't do this well. We know that the change we're doing, I think being a little more vulnerable in a transparent way, I think would build a lot of trust from people to say, yes, we're on this journey together and we appreciate you acknowledging that. There was actually a hospital system here in the Twin Cities a year or two ago that was actually their TV spots were people going through really bad experiences in their hospital. And they're saying, we know, we're working on it, we're trying. And I found it so like the fact that you acknowledge
refreshing.
That it was really refreshing. And I just think the general sense of that acknowledgement versus sort of this very stone institution sort of approach that I think a lot of people still perceive in healthcare.
I would have been very fascinated to sit in the room while they debated and decided whether to move forward with that or not, because you know that they were leaning into this, let's own it. Let's be vulnerable and own it because it's going to win us a lot. It's going to win us a lot. But
they made it genuinely funny, which helped.
True. Done well, it can go a long way. But I think, a lot of brands are scared. To go down a pathway like that because it's perceived to be too high risk, right? And there's too much at stake. But I'm kind of at the point of it might be riskier not to at this point, right? I mean, if part of what we're hearing here is it's riskier not to say the things that need to be said and be vulnerable and have high empathy. So go all in.
Yeah, if you're going to take trust seriously, then you're going to both A, be transparent and be bigger than yourself. So whether that means thought leadership around the industry or whether that means things that every word out of your mouth isn't directly marketing and benefiting you, but it's adding to the conversation. It's making people feel empowered. It's building a better information ecosystem. We always say action drives trust. That's the key, right? But trust isn't words,
Agreed.
It's action. So what are you doing to demonstrate that?
Show me. Yes. Last question. Where do you think the biggest opportunity lies for healthcare marketers in 2025?
I'm really going to come back to connected care. I think I think that's so much the promise. And I think so many things that we have right now that we talk about are one-offs. And it's like, I've got this thing at home and I've got this smart bed, or I've got this device for my diabetes, and they've got this machine in the clinic that did this. And I think people want to make those connections. And that's what we get from every other industry. Bringing this back to the whole industry thing, like when you think about how do I use my Delta Airlines app? How does my bank operate?
Yes.
How does Amazon operate?
Yes.
I think making people feel like healthcare is going to start working more like that, because it's not even close. And it's almost the only industry at this point that is like that. So I think starting to bring that promise together of all these individual things and challenges you want, we're starting to, each individual solution is adding up to a bigger whole. And again, we're doing it with that empathetic eye of making the experience better. And that's not just for patients. Physicians are in crisis, right? Nurses are in crisis. So whatever audience we're looking at that's necessary to make the healthcare ecosystem better, showing how our solutions are going to ultimately add up. I mean, if there's an innovation coming in that, and a physician said, that just means more data that's coming in that I have to look at, I'm just going to be overwhelmed more, then it's not getting us anywhere.
Right. Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's a great point and an important thing for all of us to strive towards. Paul, I feel like we could have probably talked for 2 hours on this topic. And to that point, let our listeners know that they can certainly dive in deeper to Edelman's Trust Barometer, and specifically the health report by heading to the Edelman website. And Paul, how can folks get in touch with you?
Yeah, they should just contact me directly, paul.ratzky@edelman.com. Happy to talk with anyone or share anything. But yes, we do have a section of our site with our trust information and the latest data, but happy to share anything more directly with anyone who wants to reach out.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for sharing all of these wonderful insights today. You've definitely given us all a lot to think about.
Well, thank you for the time. It was a real pleasure.
You bet. That's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed the conversation, do us a favor and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for being part of the Health Marketing Collective, where strong leadership meets marketing excellence, because the future of healthcare depends on it. We'll see you next time.